Well, good afternoon. I'm County Commissioner Debbie Lieberman, and we're happy that you're here today. And I know some of you got caught in the rain. I fortunately looked out the window before I walked over, and I drove. And don't forget your parking passes before you go also. So on behalf of the County Commissioners, Dan Foley, who just walked in, and Judy Dodge, who's probably getting soaked right now, we're so happy that we're able to do this today with you. I also am co-chairing the Education and Life Skills Work Group, along with Dr. Anissa Cheek, who is the Vice President here at Sinclair for School Community Partnerships, as well as a member of the Donor Relations Council of the United Way of Greater Dayton. Do we have any, if any of our other co-chairs are here, would you raise your hand for this effort? I know Dan Foley. Behind you. Oh, no, you're not a coach. I thought you're a facilitator. That's right. Well, we have such a good team that have volunteered to be a part of this and to co-chair these 3 different groups. And we're just really, we had a couple great sessions last week. Those panels were transportation, access, and navigation, and income, public assistance, housing, and homelessness. So it was an excellent start, and we're looking forward to today. We heard a lot of very good information from those panelists last week, and I know we will add to that this afternoon. We're going to provide you with a little bit of background information, describe the format for today, and then get the panel discussion started. So we are going to have Tom now come up and provide us with some more information. Tom? How are you, sir? Good. How are you?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
And welcome to the FCFC UW Joint Strategic Planning discussion panels this afternoon. I think you're going to find them exciting. We usually have really good information coming out of these, and we're very pleased to have you here this afternoon to listen and share in this process. I'm Tom Malsby, President and CEO of United Way of the Greater Dayton Area. I'm really excited about this opportunity for United Way and the county's Family and Children's First Council to work together to continue our partnership through the strategic planning process. It's very important in our community that we're able to combine our resources and combine our talents and our thought leadership to make sure we get the very best outcome for those in need in our community. We began the early portion of this process last summer when we released our shared community needs assessment. Many of you have probably seen that. It's a great document that depicts some very important information across multiple demographics in our community. The strategic planning process will continue through the fall in several phases that will include several large meetings with all of our members, as well as a series of meetings in the 3 work groups that the Commissioner spoke about. All of these meetings will foster a review and discussion of the results of these panels, as well as look at models that may work here, best practice approaches, and what other communities are doing to address their critical issues and needs. And through all of that, we will remain committed to integrating the 3 focus areas of education and life skills, income and stability, and health and safety in our community. The overall purpose of the strategic planning process is to emerge with a set of common priorities, early strategies, and actions to increase community alignment as we guide service delivery approaches and improve results for individuals, families, children through a more intentional, collaborative impact focus. And with the way resources are working in our community, we know we have the right strategy. And again, thank you for your participation and being here this afternoon.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Kelly, Assistant Montgomery County Administrator. I'd like to add my thanks as well for everyone attending this afternoon. My thanks to the panelists and our facilitator. So we're conducting 5 panel discussions. From our community needs assessment, we identified that there were topic areas that really rose to the top for a discussion. And what we wanted to do was to make sure that as we're looking at all three of our focus areas that you've already heard about, education, life skills, income stability, and health and safety, we're really seaming those things together. We're looking at how they interact, we're looking at how they should be integrated, we're looking at developing a plan that moves forward, that really respects the fact that they are all interdependent and must move forward together, or quite frankly, they can't succeed independently. So as you've heard earlier, we've got to make sure that all these things are important, and we hear from our panelists today. The purpose today is to hear from those panelists as they add context to what the community needs assessment reports. They each bring a particular valuable expertise that will provide us more information to fold into our ongoing process. The panel this afternoon will be facilitated by Beth Welly, and she will take over now to provide you with the format for our discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you, Tom. Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased to be a part of this very important initiative. Interestingly, one of the members of our team over the weekend sent a report that talked about a community. What is community? How is community defined? How does community work together? And I was struck by one of the quotes in that report about the definition of community. It talked about community as members of a community have an individual and collective sense that they can, as part of that community, influence their environments and each other. And I thought that my ability to read that article, to read that definition this weekend was particularly timely, as we're obviously talking about community and we're talking about the ability of individuals and the collective body to influence each other and the environment. So, as Tom said, today we have this wonderful group of expert panelists, and they are going to be answering some very thoughtful and provocative questions, providing us with much discussion point for the work to go forward. All of our panelists will be answering some questions, but none of our panelists will be answering all questions. The format will make sense to you in just a few minutes. Lots of preparation and research has gone into today's panel. So we want to give all the time that we have to the panelists to discuss the questions that we're going to ask of them. However, your input is very essential, and you all should have received index cards on your way in today. I really encourage you to take the time to share your comments or questions on those index cards. If, as we're discussing a question up here, there's something that you think is an essential part of that discussion, I beg you to put it on your index card and turn that index card in at the end of the session, because all of these notes are then what goes to the working group to move forward from here. The panelists will have 3 minutes to answer their questions. Doesn't seem like a long time. It can be. We've taken hundreds of questions and narrowed it down to the 8 or 9 that we're going to address here today. Before we begin, I would simply ask you to do one more thing for me. Make sure your phones are turned off or turned to vibrate so that we don't have that unfortunate interruption, okay? All right, so now we're going to begin. I'd like to introduce the panelists to you. Moving from my left to my right, we have Kathy Rowell from Sinclair Community College, Stan Hurdle from, if I may, Abel and Lawlow, easier for me to say it that way, Michelle Riley from the Dayton Food Bank, Mary Tyler from the National Conference for Community and Justice, known to many of us as NCCJ, Angel Barger, coming to us from Miami Valley Housing Opportunities, and Jan Lepore-Jenelson from East End Community Services. So these are our wonderful panelists today, and again, I want to thank you for your time with us today. So let's go to the first question. What poverty, discrimination, culture, stigma, fear strategies have the potential to have the greatest impact across all 3 of the focus areas? And again, these are the focus areas that Tom has already outlined for us: education and life skills, health and safety, income and stability. So Kathy, if we could, we'll start with you, and then panelists will simply work from left to right.
I think it took 3 minutes to read the question. It was a long one. So I'm a professor of sociology, so I think it's important to understand that I'm not a practitioner, I'm an academic, but I've spent most of my career studying and working with the poor in Dayton. I've worked at the Salvation Army, I've worked at St. Vincent, and so I also was born into poverty. I'm Appalachian, and my family moved here, so my whole life's work, including all my publications, are on the poor. So I think my answers might be slightly different. I want to note that Dayton is a highly residentially segregated community. Highly segregated communities equate to higher levels of discrimination and fear of others who are different. There are numerous strategies to help the poor. Just last week, if you haven't had a chance, there was a conference at Georgetown University. Barack Obama, our president, was there, as well as some really amazing speakers on the issue of poverty. And he said the following, which I think is really important as we have this discussion. What used to be racial segregation now mirrors itself in class segregation. This great sorting has taken place. It creates its own politics. There are some communities where not only do I not know poor people, I don't even know people who have trouble paying their bills. I just don't know these people. And so there's less sense of investment in those children. The number one way, when you look at the literature on how to reduce fear, stigma, prejudice, and discrimination, is to create opportunities for people from different walks of life to work side by side. Everyone needs to be treated as an equal. For example, when I go to serve at a homeless shelter, I am serving the poor, but I would argue a better model would be to work side by side to feed one another. When I work at a soup kitchen, and I've worked at several in Dayton, I need to take some time to sit down with my fellow community members and eat with them and get to know them. We have created this mentality that there's something wrong with the poor. And I would argue, if you've not been in poverty, poverty is stressful and depressing. It's no wonder that people in poverty aren't able to sometimes go to school and help their children do well in school, or they don't show up at community meetings. And if you look at some of the assessment that we did in Montgomery County, a lot of people complain on where are the poor and why they're not involved. I think we've forgotten that poverty is very stressful and also depressing. To top it all off, middle-class people have stress and depression, but we don't judge them the same way as we do the poor. In the end, I think what we have to do is recognize this, and we all need to work with people and hang out with people and spend time with people that are different from us. And finally, I would just argue that anyone working with the poor or working with people that are different needs some really good cultural competency training, and we should be requiring that of anyone in the service. I'll end at that.
Thank you. Stan.
Okay. ABLE and LAWO are essentially legal aid for those who aren't familiar with those. America has not successfully dealt with poverty and the way poverty is learned and passed on. Poverty is not just an income measure, but it's a social and psychological situation where people are marginalized, have low status, deprived, and in distress. This can easily lead to behaviors that harm you or may help you survive in that context, but they also reinforce the views of others that poverty is deserved. We need to recognize the role that these psychological, spiritual, and human relations aspects of poverty play in both poor people and non-poor people like us and how we perpetuate poverty. We have to recognize the benefits. Eliminating poverty really outweighs the benefits of keeping poverty the way it is. And poverty does benefit some people. Poverty provides cheap labor, cheap goods. Maybe it's motivating. Maybe you think it's how society should be with good rewards. It also disperses social anger in unproductive ways. However, as inequality of income and wealth increase, the middle class is being emptied out, and fewer people have income and wealth security, and more people are just a lost job or illness away from being poor. Americans tend to blame the poor for their plight, assume that if a few can escape poverty, everyone else can too. Many people emphasize choices, personal responsibility. They really ignore the way that society operates to create and perpetuate poverty. We don't own up to how we participate in that, and we underestimate our ability to do something about it. So we need to start by changing hearts and minds before we change programs. We need to reclaim the moral validity of equality of all people from our patriotic and faith traditions. And Americans' productivity needs to be shared more justly than it is now. We need to overcome the feelings of scarcity, that there's not enough for everybody, and that if we don't keep things the way they are, we or our children will be poor instead. We need to avoid the us versus them dynamic, recognize that all lives matter, all people have value. You can't marginalize anyone. And we need a sense of community with everyone. We need to recognize that some people who have trouble functioning because they have subtle disabilities that aren't really obvious. And everybody needs some power to be productive, do good for others. We have to create real hope that things will be better and have a political system that's more responsive to everyone's needs and involves everybody, not just some.
Thank you. Michelle.
Sure. So I'd like to restate the question, because you have to be smarter than a fifth grader, right? So to me, when I read the question, it said, what's the one thing that we can do that would be most impactful, that would touch every one of the areas that we're interested in, every pillar? And it really, that framing the question that way made the answer really jump out for me. And that is, if we could better coordinate services, we're all experts in what we do, but if we could coordinate case management, if we could coordinate transportation, our clients wouldn't be spending so much time going from nonprofit to nonprofit and being reassessed when they already have an assessment. So I think the one thing that the community could try to do with the help of United Way and the Human Services Levy is to actually coordinate our services. We're all doing great work, but it's frustrating to be poor and to get on a bus and go from stop to stop to stop to talk and tell your story over and over and over again, and to do that twice as much as the services you're actually receiving.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yep.
Mary.
Okay, thank you, Beth. I have a couple of areas I want to focus on. Number one, we all understand that economic stability is one of the most pressing issues facing our communities and our nation today. It's my belief that we need to create a culture of valuing education, which leads to economic stability. Our children and families indeed need to understand that without education, chances are very limited. Moving forward is very limited. And once a student enters school, I believe it's our community's responsibility and also my responsibility to ensure that we do everything humanly possible to support them. Lifting up and promoting those stories of success stories of what our children are doing, I think is critically important. There are enough people in our community that we can adopt a family, an individual student, to shepherd throughout his or her or their life to ensure their success. The other area includes beginning to instill in our students the importance of self-respect and respect for others. One's ability to understand that they have value and to surround themselves with a circle of friends and supporters who encourage them, I believe, is essential. The other aspect of that is communicating high expectations to every citizen in the Miami Valley. Certainly will change the community. And while we expect our schools to educate our children, I believe it's our responsibility to raise them. Let me repeat that again, to raise them to be respectful, contributing, and productive individuals. And while things are challenging, and I've been there myself as someone who had to endure the welfare system when it was the welfare system, I still had the understanding that I could do better than my current circumstances. And so as long as I had people around me that were encouraging me, I moved out of those conditions. And so from my standpoint, there is a way to change our community.
Very good. Thank you. Angel, could we have your thoughts on this question?
Yes. Well, I work with individuals who are homeless. And so I deal with this not only on a day-to-day basis with my clients, but I also speak from my own personal experience. I grew up in poverty, and I feel that most people are only a couple steps away from being back in that predicament, at least for me. I think that people living in poverty have to deal with a lot of things that most people aren't used to having to deal with. They have to to say the least, do things that we wouldn't think about doing. How am I going to eat tonight? Well, I think I might have to go steal something from a grocery store because I don't have anybody to help, a lack of supports. People are fearful to ask for help because a lot of times when you do ask for help, there's a stigma that, people who are living in poverty, they choose to live that way, and that is absolutely not correct. Sometimes it's circumstantial, and sometimes that's all they know. They may have grown up that way. There are also a lot of other things that stick out to me. My clients deal with mental illness, and that causes them to sometimes draw back from different people and not really want to ask for help or even know that they need help at times. Sometimes there's a lack of, I think, availability of knowing what resources are out there. I'm still learning myself every day that there are lots of things out here to help people. It's just a matter of letting those people know that it is available to them. Definitely increasing, I think, as a whole, all of our empathy towards the situation. Not necessarily to feel sorry for those people that are dealing with that, but just understand that we really haven't all walked in their shoes. Everybody has, a different take on life. Everybody's been through different things that have put them in the place that they're in. So being more understanding, making things known, and doing a lot of outreach in the schools too. I think that an individual would be able to assess, maybe through the children what might be going on at home, and being knowledgeable about the services and able to send that information home to the children, I think would make a big difference. That's about it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Jan, if you could answer the final question, the first question.
The first question, thank you. We know that growing up poor is the single most predictor of living a life of poverty. I believe that poverty in our community is the single biggest threat toward future economic viability in this community. If you look at Ohio, the poverty rate among children is 24%. In Montgomery County, it's 27.5%. In the neighborhoods of East Dayton that I serve, 63% of the children who live in inner East Dayton live below 100% of poverty. Now, I'm outraged by that, and I think everybody in this room needs to be outraged by that, and it's time that we addressed it. We've got another community initiative on, that we all know and love, Learn to Earn, and we're trying to make sure that there is an economic future by getting our workforce prepared for the jobs in our community. And I think it's statistically impossible to achieve the goal of 60% of our young people having some kind of graduate degree or post-secondary education without, unless we address the problems of poverty that's holding our kids back. So I've got three strategies I'd like to suggest. The first one is we've got to make work count. We've got to get the minimum wage up. It's ridiculous now. Nobody can live on $8.10 an hour and raise a family. And so naturally, folks would rather stay in the public assistance system than try to get a job. Well, let's turn it around on the employers and ask them to increase the wages that they're willing to pay for work. The second objective, I would say, strategy is to create entry-level jobs for unskilled people. who've never been in or who've been out of the workforce for a long time. We should focus county economic development resources on creating low-skilled entry-level jobs for folks, and we need to create a financial pool of resources to help social enterprises that will employ low-income entry-level workers so they can get the training that they need. We've got to have that resource available to create those jobs. And then third, I would implement a 2-generation poverty intervention strategy. And that's one which would align public funding streams to support both children and their parents in the same family with coordinated resources in a way that provides opportunities for and meets the needs of low-income children to get ready for school and to do well in school and make their parents simultaneously do better in the workplace.
Very good. Thank you. All right, so now we're going to move to our second question, and Kathy and Stan, this question is for you. So, how do we unbundle the general descriptive nature of poverty into actionable items that can make a difference to improve results in these 3 areas that we've been talking about? Kathy, if we could start with you.
I think I should let Stan go since I went first the last time.
All right.
Sure.
Yeah. Want to be fair about going first, so.
Okay. I think that poverty is a self-reinforcing combination of barriers and deprivations that all need to be dealt with. If you try and resolve some of them and not others, the problem that you don't resolve is the one that's going to sink your client. And we see this happen at Legal Aid. The group has chosen probably the most important areas to actually fighting poverty, which is education, life skills, health and safety, income and stability. That's really great choices. We need a holistic approach to poverty, looking at the entire person, or what Jan said, with the entire family makes sense. We need to rethink how we fund social services to avoid short-term funding of projects that lack staying power, and just when you got them going, they go away. We need to rethink how we fund things. Things I would do, we need to improve urban schools. And a way to do that is to get input from the universities in the area, but also the suburban school districts and the citizens there, all working to see that all kids need to be educated and skilled, and that's a job for the entire community. We can't have people fleeing to the suburbs because of the schools and expect the community to survive. We need to ensure everyone gets adequate health care, simplify health insurance, avoid gaps, denials of coverage, things of that sort. We need to create more jobs and services in poverty areas, probably using local and cooperative ownership, and pay a living wage. We need to encourage cross-cultural interactions between the social classes, the races, ethnicities, that are going to promote a sense that this community is all in this together. We're one society. We have to care what happens to others. We need to promote the resolution of disputes, certainly without violence. We need to intervene in particularly abusive family situations, cycles of abuse. We need to deal with the demand for substance abuse that our society really creates. And it creates feelings that people are worthless unless they do consumerism and buying stuff. That doesn't really work. We need to require justice in the marketplace. We need to limit the excessive debt that you see people get into and the various penalties for being in debt and losing everything, getting evicted, having to start over, things like that require a just marketplace and not just a profitable one.
All right, Kathy, how do we unbundle into actionable items?
So I took a little different approach. I like to think about definitions of poverty. When we think about them, I think it's important, if we're going to unbundle, to think about 3 categories. I think we need to look at situational poverty, generational poverty, and chronic poverty. And when you look at all the services we provided and you look at the history of government assistance in the United States and look at our policy, almost everything that we've created in the United States was to really end situational poverty. SNAP was not meant to be permanent. Low-income housing was not meant to be permanent. Government assistance was never meant to be permanent. So everything that we created starting right during the World War on Poverty was meant to be situational. So we have not taken a hard look at chronic poverty and generational poverty. In fact, when you look at definitions in the United States Census, we don't even define those very well. And I see Amy in the audience from the city. We've been working on this a little bit and talking about it. So you look at government definitions, we don't even measure chronic poverty very well. You have to be continuously poor 3 to 4 years. There's one major study in the United States, the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, that's tried to do that. And we look at generational poverty, and I really appreciate what Jan said. It's something I'm going to build upon later, that we don't do enough for children in poverty. So we can, I believe we can stop generational poverty. I've always thought that, and we have to start with the kids. And there's a great book I'm going to recommend. Robert Putnam just published an amazing book called Our Kids. And it's about the fact that we've lost this notion in our communities that everyone's children are our children. And we have to create communities that help all children flourish, not just poor children, and take a hard look at our communities. I think if we could separate out poverty and pay a little bit more attention to generational and chronic. For the most part, research shows that government assistance for those in situational poverty is working. SNAP is great, right? Getting some assistance with housing is great. It's the chronic and generationally poor that we've been failing for a long time. And I think it's because we just haven't paid enough attention to it. And it's hard work. It's very, very difficult. And I think that's the other reason. It's going to cost more money, which no one ever wants to talk about. But I think if we could, I'm excited about it. I'm so excited about what we're doing in the county that I really think if we could take a hard look at children and look at what other communities are doing, that we could stop poverty for them tomorrow. And I think of all the work we could do, if we could end poverty for children so they're not repeating it, it would really be a powerful thing for our community.
Good. All right, our next question is for Michelle, Jan, and Kathy. Given that childhood poverty can have negative effects on future health and education attainment and can lead to intergenerational poverty, what are the most effective ways for the health and human services system to intervene? So we're really picking right up on where you left off. And we'll start with you, Michelle.
38,000 children in Montgomery, Greene, and Preble report food insecurity. The food bank sends out 1,400 backpacks a week. We have 323 kids still on the waiting list. Those are kids that are not on free and reduced. They are already on free and reduced, but that's not what the program's for. This is a program where a school psychologist, counselor, and or teacher, administrator has identified the child as not having 3 healthy meals on the weekend. 9 million pounds of food distributed. So we would want the Human Services Levy and United Way to continue to support the 96 member agencies that we work with. We would want you to utilize SNAP so that the funds that you are given, you can make decisions, tough ones like medication, housing, rent. And the last thing is we want to continue to work with the schools for pantries and or mobile produce. But when I read the question, so that's my initial, there's the 3 things we do that we want you to keep doing that we think are good strategies for a Band-Aid, right? But that's what that is a Band-Aid. We are trying at the food bank because we feel like with 96 voices and with some state influence with lobbyists, that the concentration of where our thought should be is how to shorten the line. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, you can define it however you want, but how do you shorten the line? How do you, in the same 3 groups, just again, because I have to talk about it with people who aren't always educated, we look at it 3 ways, right? The churches were set up as pantries to serve Sally, who might be blind, who her parents are always going to have to take care of, and that's why we set the pantries up. And then there's generational poverty, which divides our politics, our left, our right, judgment calls, bias to the table. But there's a new group, and it's the group that's the working poor. And they're the ones I'm most concerned about because they've never been in our line before. They were donors prior to this, and because of not being able to make a sustainable wage, they're in my food lines. So that's where our time should be spent. That's where the conversations have to change, and that's where tough decisions have to be made.
Good. Jan?
So there's a lot of research going on right now at Harvard, at the Aspen Institute, and Crittenden Women's Union, if you want to check that out, around two-generation intervention strategies. And I'm going to sound like a one-trick pony here, but I want to talk about breaking the cycle of generational poverty through a two-generation model, and we call it 2Gen. So basically, we're talking about addressing the needs of young children who are living in poverty to develop the foundational skills they need for learning, and minimize the impact of toxic stress that has a major negative influence on brain development. That's what poverty does. It influences young children's brain development, and it actually impedes the learning function later on. So you got high poverty in a school system, you're going to have kids who need an awful lot of intervention, right? So we got to stop that right where it is, and the only way you can do that, according to the research, and I'm beginning to believe this, I've been at this a while, is that we have to provide a pathway for parents to improve their family's economic stability. There's 5 core components of a two-generation intervention strategy. Early childhood education, high quality child care and education for 3 and 4-year-olds, post-secondary and employment pathways for parents, management and growth of economic assets. Families need to learn how to manage their money, okay? They need health and well-being services for the whole family. Maternal depression is a huge problem in families, and it again sets up toxic stress for the child, and his or her brain development is going to be affected. So we've got to get the right assets. Mental health assets and supports are critical to this population. And then social capital. We found through our TOTS program, working with parents of young children, that they learn best when they're in a supportive, positive, peer environment, a social context. People learn and change in a social context. You don't do it in an isolated way. So those 5 components are possible with the funding streams that are out there if we can figure out how to bring those funding streams together more effectively. And it's being done around the country. Dayton is way behind. There's only, and so is Ohio, but there are opportunities to really relook at the dollars that we're spending in this community, start removing the silos and encompassing the family as a whole, including those kids, and getting it done once and for all. Otherwise, I don't see much of a future for our community with the poverty rates that we're suffering right now.
And Kathy?
I'm going to end up repeating a lot of what Jan said, so I'll just make my points. One of the most effective ways to prevent generational poverty, and you heard Jan say it, and I think we would all agree, is to make high-quality early childhood education available for all kids. And I would argue that eventually what we need to do in our country, which we haven't got to yet, is we just need to mandate it. Our education system was based on a rural model. It was also based on a one-parent model, that one parent would be working. And I think we are eventually, and by the way, most industrialized countries in the world do have required, paid for, provided by early childhood education programs for children. And we know when you look at the research that it's one of the best predictors of helping children go ahead and continue and do well in school. If they can't read by 3rd grade, it's pretty dismal. If they can't read by 3rd grade, they go on to a lifetime of not being successful in education. And we can really nip that if we start with early childhood education. Also need to take a hard look, and I know we do a lot of it, but again, is it possible to mandate summer programming for children to help reduce the loss of what students lose in the summer? I teach here at Sinclair. College students lose everything they learn over the summer. You know, wish we could get them to come and keep up with their work. But it's not just losing what you learn, but it's also not having access to breakfast and lunch. And so thinking about ways to do that, providing high quality after school programming. And I know my sister, who's a public school teacher and president of a union, would shoot me for saying this, but eventually we have to take a hard look at how many hours a day kids go to school. Again, the model that we have in the United States was based on a farming agricultural model that kids need to be home by 3 to help milk the cows. I grew up on a farm, so I'm well aware of that. But when you really think about it, if we matched our schooling and education with parents' work schedules, 8 to 5, we would reduce the latchkey school problem. We'd probably have more opportunities for kids to learn and not take tests 24/7. But again, that's something that I think it's going to be a long way before we see that. And then finally, we have to develop programs to support parents. We have to remember parenting is not something you know how to do. I didn't know what to do. I had parents that were good role models. And then to top it all off, we have many people having children that had not planned to have children. It's a shock, it's stressful, it's no surprise we see a lot of postpartum depression in our country, and we need to figure out ways to support families.
Very good. Thank you. All right, so we're going to move on to question 4. Michelle, we're going to start with you, Mary, Angel, and then Kathy. So how does food hardship affect a family's or an individual's health and their performance on the job or in school? And certainly we've been hearing about it, but...
So I'll go with the top 2. For adults, seniors, it's diabetes. They're making decisions for food that are poor decisions, and so laced with sugar, high fructose, all those things. So we're seeing a huge increase. In fact, several of the research firms are looking at what is exactly the increase of those diabetes going to be on our healthcare system. So that's number 1 for adults. For children specifically, the number 1 is iron deficiency. And of course, you can't study when you have a tummy that's grumbling. And so we see in adults anxiety and depression, poor performance in the workplace. In children, we see the high iron content and, of course, poor performance across the board. They are at the highest risk for hospitalization before the age of 3rd grade, and overall their health in general is poor. And that's all documented research. I mean, there's no surprise there.
And Mary, in your work, what have you come across?
Well, within the work we do with a number of young people throughout the Miami Valley, when they're worrying about their basic needs or how they're going to eat or what they're going to eat, then things like school become less important to them. We've had an opportunity to ask young people to journal their day. And it is just heartbreaking to hear and read about some of the stories where they talk about they're so sleepy in school, they can't concentrate, or they're thinking about what they're not going to eat, or if they're in school, they're thinking about what someone has talked about as it relates to a food item. And there is nothing that you can do other than to help them understand that there are resources in the community for their families and try and direct them to those particular resources. That's as it relates to young people, just their inability to concentrate when they're in school. As it relates to parents, and I'll echo some of the things that Michelle talked about, and this is from a personal experience I talked about in the first question that I responded to. We lived in poverty, grew up in poverty, and I can remember often my mom not going without food because she was ensuring that we had some, and the headaches that she would endure throughout the day were just excruciating for her. Not only that, when she talked about going to work, she was thinking about something else and she would miss the bus because she was concentrating on what am I going to feed the children when I get home, or what am I going to get the kids in order to get them to bed. And so as I grew up, still trying to prevent myself from creating some of that same generational poverty, there were incidents where I had to experience, let me make sure my children eat, and I went without. And so I know firsthand what that experience is like. And it is not a pretty place to be in, but through the help of others in the community and in my family, we were able to overcome it. And I think that's what's missing in our community. We have some well-intended people, but to make a drastic change in the lives of families, you need to walk in those shoes.
All right, Angel, what would you share about this?
Again, I speak from personal experience. Not having food, an adequate amount of food or the proper nutrition, and going to school or trying to perform the duties that you're expected to at work can be very difficult. Difficult when you haven't eaten, because you are trying to make sure that your children are eating, and because it becomes consuming. You can only think about, how am I going to feed myself? How am I going to get through this day? Not having the food that you need also causes a great deal of stress, which leads to a lack of sleep, which also makes it very difficult for an individual to perform those tasks. Excuse me. It's very difficult also for individuals who are living in poverty to sometimes get to the places where they can get food. For example, different pantries and things of that nature. And a lot of these pantries are ran during the week, which wouldn't coincide very well with an individual who works during the week being able to get there. So it becomes, what's more important, this job or my survival? And that's a hard choice to make sometimes. I've also seen families that have kept their children at home with them instead of sending them to school, because it was easier for them to take their child with them so that they could help carry some of the food back on public transportation or walk with it across town, because they just couldn't do it on their own. So those are some of the main concerns that I think that there is with food hardship.
Thank you. Kathy?
I think there's, two types of food hardship when you think about it. There's people that don't have enough food, and there's people that don't have quality food. And I think obesity is becoming a serious problem in our community as well and in the country, but I'm going to mostly talk about the other type of food hardship. I just thought I'd read some statistics that I think everybody is probably familiar with, but hunger and undernutrition affects child development. We know it affects brain development. You've heard that a couple times. I think the one thing that we're seeing in our community when you read reports of education, increasingly people are complaining about children that don't behave in school. And we end up blaming parents or poor quality parenting for that. But when you look at research on hunger, children who are hungry exhibit 7 to 12 times as many symptoms of conduct disorder, such as fighting, blaming others for problems, having trouble with a teacher, not listening to rules, stealing, than their non-hungry peers do. Among low-income children, those classified as hungry show increased anxiousness, irritability, aggressiveness, and oppositional behavior in comparison to peers. But we end up judging them and saying there's something wrong with them and their parents aren't doing their job. I don't like the commercial because my students think it's funny, but the Snickers commercial about being hangry, angry and hungry, it's true. Right? They've made a commercial about it. If you've not seen it, somebody has to get a Snickers bar and then they become nice. But it's true for our students. And I teach at a college, and you would be surprised the numbers of community college students that come to school hungry. To the point now that I bring bagels to all my classes with cream cheese, and I buy peanut butter and jelly and bread and have it in my office. And students are telling me stories about a lot of single men, especially aren't having access to food, and they'll come just to get a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to make it through the day. And it affects test performance, and hunger affects any type of performance, right? And you've had this. If you've gone all day without eating, and you've had to speak in front of a group of people, or you've come to work, it's a long day, but imagine being hungry for a couple weeks or 3 weeks. And I work in the developing world, and I've seen starvation, and it's devastating. And we have people in the United States that are so hungry that functioning each and every day is really, really difficult. Yet we blame them. We blame them when they act angry or act out. I know that if you're in the social services and you've waited on people or helped clients, sometimes their anger and their stress and distress with you are really because they're just hungry. And I think we need to think about that in our community.
Thank you. Very sobering.